Hello there. Welcome to Just the Discs. We talk about Blu-rays here. Today I am talking about one new one from Fun City Editions and then a whole bunch of Warner Archive. That's what we're dealing with here. But let's get into Fun City. As you all know, one of my favorite labels out there. They continue their streak of putting out very interesting and underseen gems. With this new one is called Stranger's Kiss. It is ostensibly from 1983. It is directed by Matthew Chapman, and it stars Blaine Novak, Victoria Tennant, Peter Coyote, Dan Shore, Richard Romanus. And it is a fascinating movie. It's a good film, but I would say that maybe the story of how it got made is even more fascinating, because what it is sort of an imagining of the behind-the-scenes story of Stanley Kubrick's Killer's Kiss. But there's a lot more that goes into this movie and how it was made and how high the production value is, considering I think it's a $150,000 movie. So it's set in 1955, and Peter Coyote plays Stanley, I guess a stand-in for Stanley Kubrick, and he is trying to make this movie about a boxer, and he hires two actors. One is played by Blaine Novak, and the other is played by Victoria Tennant. And she is actually involved with a mobster who loans the money to make the movie. That is Richard Romanus, and Dan Shore is sort of his assistant director, just general right-hand man, basically. And Dan Shore, I'm a big fan of Dan Shore, but folks would know him probably the most maybe as Billy the Kid from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. He's also in Tron. He is in Strange Behavior. He's in a lot of movies that I dig, and I like him a lot. And Peter Coyote coming back to the Fun City Collection after their wonderful release of Heartbreakers, which I still recommend folks grab if you haven't. A very fascinating and affecting movie about male friendship. I really like that one. But okay, so this is Stranger's Kiss. So now that's kind of the story. I mean, the story is that, the Blaine Novak character starts to fall for the Victoria Tennant character and vice versa, and that's problematic because she's got a mobster boyfriend, and Peter Coyote is running around being not quite tyrannical, but definitely a little rough. And it's interesting because what I've heard about Killer's Kiss is that, and I think Stanley Kubrick is even quoted as saying something like this to one of the cast, but he was, as I understand it, he was nice to his cast and crew because, as he told one of them, this movie's not going to do anything for any of you except me. And I think he appreciated that fact and thus was not tyrannical on that set, I think. So this is, again, a fictionalization. Now, where does this come from? Who is Blaine Novak? That's a good question, right? Blaine Novak is a fascinating dude. He is an actor, writer. He's the co-writer on this, and he is a co-writer on They All Laughed, Peter Bogdanovich's film. There's a great bunch of extras on this. So, okay, first of all, this is a new 4K restoration from its original 35mm internegative, and it includes a newly recorded commentary by Walter Chow, new video interviews with director co-writer Matthew Chapman, actor co-writer Blaine Novak, actor Victoria Tennant, and producer Doug Dilge. plus a new video essay by Chris O'Neill. So a lot of great features on this, and I love the sort of throwback artwork there. There is a reversible wrap as well. And we have, of course, a booklet essay, which I will sample real quick here. This is by Peter Tungette. I think it's all him. Movies about movies are unusually susceptible to the expressions of sentimentality. Sometimes the small surrounds the making of a movie, as in Francois Truffaut's Day for Night. Other times the hokum extends to the very concept of, quote, the movies, as in Peter Bogdanovich's Nickelodeon, Giuseppe Tornatore's Cinema Paradiso, Steven Spielberg's The Fabelmans, and too many others to name. Even those movies that aim to cast a cynical eye on movie making, everything from The Player to The Big Picture to State and Main, generally focus their contempt on the silliness and wantonness of the movie-making business. Movie-making itself is still presented as a grand and glorious thing. The sinuous, beautifully nuanced American independent film Stranger's Kiss is a far rarer and stranger beast, a movie that comes to neither romanticize the art form nor merely satirize the superciliousness of the industry. Instead, director Chapman and co-writer star Blaine Novak grapple with a far thornier, more complex subject, the furtive yet consequential emotional connections and confusions that always form in the hothouse of a movie set. Good essay, definitely worth a full read, but that is a sample of that. So, another just really great release, a movie that has been underseen for years, had basically disappeared in a lot of ways. And so I love when Fun City digs these up. But the tricky part about that is that this movie's profile is a little bit low. And so I think a lot of people don't know what it is. They've never heard of it. They may not know who Blaine Novak is. Victoria Tennant they may recognize. Peter Coyote they may recognize. But it's a movie that needs a boost. So I would say to anybody interested, it's worth taking a chance on, definitely. But let's get into the story of the making of this film, which is gone into great detail. And it's not quite a Rashomon situation, but you have the four principals, telling the story of the movie, and some have certain things to say about the origins, and some have contradictory things. It doesn't really matter, but I do find those contradictions amusing. But I'll start with Blaine Novak, because I really think he is a very special dude who's just like a character. He's just a fascinating character. He is, in his interview, which is about 25 minutes long, and there was something that came out on Twitter right after this came out, where somebody was watching this interview and saying they'd love to see an entire documentary on Blaine Novak, and I second that request. I would love to see a documentary about this guy, because there's just so many stories he's just barely touching on. So he opens this thing by talking about hooking up with John Cassavetes and getting involved with a woman under the influence after coming out to Los Angeles. And after that, he starts a distribution company with Doug Dilge, and they distribute several films. He's just a movie guy, but he likes making movies too and distributing movies. So they distribute several films with their company, including Joan Micklin-Silver's Hester Street. And then he hooks up with Bernardo Bertolucci, and that then connected him to Jack Nicholson. And then he became really good friends with Jack Nicholson. Jack Nicholson was actually considered for the director role in this movie, but the timing just didn't work out. And that's a bummer, because I love Peter Coyote, but obviously Jack Nicholson being in this movie would mean more people would remember it and more people would know it. But anyway, the Nicholson connection's great. I guess he lived with Nicholson for like a year, moved in with him for a year, and then he finds his way to meeting Peter Bogdanovich while he's working on St. Jack, and then he and Bogdanovich hit it off, and they start to write They All Laugh together. He's living in Bogdanovich's house, and Bogdanovich is letting him drive his Rolls Royce and all this stuff. Bogdanovich does end up sort of bumping him out of credit for the writing on They All Laughed, and Blaine is fantastic in They All Laughed. This is a bit more of a low-key performance in Stranger's Kiss, but he's very like higher energy, charismatic. Like in They All Laughed, it's one of those things where you're like, who is that guy? Because everybody else in the cast, it's like a really great all-star cast, John Ritter and Ben Gazzara and Audrey Hepburn, all these people, Colleen Camp, and you know them, and you're just like, who's this long-haired, curly-haired guy? And he's just so funny, and just, he really is a dude that immediately when I saw him, I was like, this guy's been in other movies, right? And I don't know how much he had done prior to that in terms of films, but it's one of those actors, he's like fully formed, and he's just dynamic in this way that my point is that you get how he connected to all these people in Hollywood, because he's just somebody that you can see yourself wanting to talk to and being interested in. So anyway, he gets involved with Bogdanovich. He stars in the film. He co-writes They All Laughed. They finish They All Laughed, and he goes into the interview, he goes into more details about that production and stuff, but the bottom line is that Dorothy Stratton obviously stars in that film, and that's when Peter Bogdanovich was fully entranced with her. They were a couple, and, well, they were sort of a couple. She was married. That was the problem, and that ended up being a fatal problem, because she was killed by her husband in a horrible, tragic murder, and then he killed himself. Star 80 is sort of the story of that tragedy. But what happens, obviously, is that affects everybody involved in They All Laughed, and obviously destroys Peter Bogdanovich. Like, I don't think he ever recovered really from it. Although he did make some good movies post They All Laughed, which I think is a fantastic film, and one that only has a DVD at the moment, which I have, but I would love to see get a Blu-ray. Anyway, Dorothy Stratton dying means nobody wants to touch They All Laughed. It becomes a movie that Peter then just continues to sort of work on forever, because he doesn't want it to end. I think partially because it has Dorothy in it, and he's reminded of her. It's a very sad story, but the other thing that it does is it completely derails Blaine Novak's budding career. And it's not that he's complaining about it necessarily, but when you hear him talk about it, you're like, oh, that's pretty sad. I mean, obviously the tragedy itself is horrible, but it's one of those things where he was just right on the cusp. Like, if They All Laugh had come out and, probably done pretty well, it definitely would have been a movie that would have gotten him a lot more work. So that's early 80s, right? And so his career just goes in the tank, basically, after They All Laughed. And he starts coming up with some ideas. He's just always got ideas to pitch for movies. And there's a great story about this group of Hollywood hopefuls and insiders, people that were acting like, I think Daryl Hannah and Rachel Ward had a house. That's one of the stories you hear. And that this movie was sort of conceived at a party at their house, where Matthew Chapman and Blaine Novak met, and Blaine Novak pitched the story to him. And it was just a crazy thing where I guess Novak at one point, his girlfriend or something, had to get up early for something, and he ended up watching Killer's Kiss on the Z channel. And he started thinking about that movie, and I think he may have talked to Stanley Kubrick about it, because he worked as liaison between Jack Nicholson and Stanley on The Shining, as I understand it. And so he got some of the behind the scenes from Kubrick, if I'm getting this right. Forgive me if I'm not. But he sort of came up with his own idea for this behind the scenes of making Killer's Kiss. Concurrent with that, Doug Dilge, his buddy, partner in the distribution company, a really great producer and a really neat guy who has an interview on this disc as well, gets them an office on the Culver lot. It's the Culver Studios lot, basically, and it becomes this incredible moment where there's an actor strike. And so all the studio work that had been coming through this lot, which had seen the likes of King Kong and Citizen Kane, and was just a big, huge, studio lot with all the props and all the sets and things like that you could use. This studio is suddenly empty because the pipeline has dried up. The studio's pushed everything through. And so Blaine pitches the idea to Michael Chapman. Michael Chapman would go on to write things like The Color of Night, Consenting Adults, Runaway Jury. I think he'd only directed one other film, maybe or so before this, maybe a couple. And they just hit it off, and they started writing this script. And then suddenly Doug and Blaine, again, a very personable guy, they got to know the studio head of the Culver Studios, just the higher-ups there. And they sort of pitched them on this idea. Can we shoot a movie here? You guys don't have anything going on, is sort of how I understand it. And they were so well liked that they were given a deal, a deferred payment deal, to have the run of the studio. So now you have a movie where they were able to raise $150,000. I think the idea was to make it for the money that Kubrick had, which was $75,000. I think they found out later he had more. Anyway, it was $150,000, and they have the run of the studio. So the movie looks so much bigger than it is because they have this studio and they have this movie being filmed on the studio. They have the behind the scenes, which still is using the studio locations. All this stuff looks great. It's really well shot. I forget the name of the DP. He's Russian. There's some really great stories about that guy throughout these interviews. And so it's just a fascinating story of this film getting made at just the right time. And it gets picked up by Orion Classics, and unfortunately they don't really know. I guess they don't either put enough effort behind it. They don't know what to do with it. And so it comes out, but it doesn't do that well. And another thing was that this story was so crazy that it was all over the trades, talking about this group of four people, Victoria, Blaine, and Chapman and Doug Dilge, making this movie for $150,000. So when they were trying to sell it, everybody in town knew that they only spent $150,000 on it, and it was deferred, and so they didn't even spend that yet, basically, or there's something along those lines. So they couldn't get a big, payout on this movie, a big buyout. But man, there's so much more to this than what I'm telling you. But that's just sort of the basis of it, right? And there's so much cool stuff in this, like the boxing gloves that Blaine Novak's character gets hired as the actor. To be this boxer. He doesn't look like he should be a boxer, but he's just got so much charisma that Peter Coyote hires him. And he wears boxing gloves. He apparently knew Robert De Niro as well, and De Niro loaned him the gloves from Raging Bull, so those are the gloves he's wearing in the movie. But it's really neat because you'll see the movie being filmed, and those scenes are in black and white, and then boom, we'll cut, and then we're in color, and we're on the studio, and we're behind the scenes. And so it's just a fascinating story of them making this movie, but I love this whole idea of getting this movie made, right? How did it happen? So you have the interview with Blaine Novak. I could have listened to another hour of that. There's another interview with Matthew Chapman, about 24 and a half minutes, talking about his history, his side of how the story was made, meeting at the party, and stuff like that. Lots of interesting stuff about Bertolucci. I think they got, was it Bertolucci's composer? There's so much stuff that comes together in such a cool way. And when you see Blaine, he's just a guy where you really want to root for him, like you can see why people liked him. And, okay. So then we have an interview with Victoria Tennant that's about 24 minutes long. And then we have, Doug Dilge, talking about his own journey. It's a great interview with him. That's about 32 and a half minutes. He seems the most factually accurate. Like he seems like there's some other stuff where Blaine's telling it and I just can't tell what's real and what's not and what's imagined or anyway. Then the essay by Chris O'Neill, 9 minutes 40 seconds. Starts out comparing Killer's Kiss and Stranger's Kiss, and then goes on to sort of do the usual cool stuff that Chris does with his video essays. It's a great video essay. And the commentary from Walter Chow is great. So this is a wonderful package. High recommend from me. There's a couple different slipcovers. If you go to funcity.com, I think you can get either or. But another great gem from Fun City. So a big recommend for Stranger's Kiss. Like, I'm just barely scratching the surface with that story. I gave you the basics. But watching those interviews, it becomes one of the most fascinating movies that was made in terms of the process. And I just love that. So anyway, let's talk about some Warner Archive stuff. We got some classics. You know, this is kind of ostensibly noir tinged in its way, because you've got mobsters, you've got jealous boyfriends and mob money. And anyway, so this is more noir stuff from the folks at Warner Archive. You can snag these from, you know, your usual online retailers, but also from moviezing.com. And so this one's directed by Fred Zinnemann. I talked about him the last round of Warner Archive Blu-rays, where they put out his film Nun Story. This one's from 1948. It stars Van Heflin, Robert Ryan, Janet Leigh, Mary Astor, Phyllis Thaxter, some other very recognizable faces. But this one is pretty interesting. It's the story of a guy, a successful developer. I think if he develops like property or builds buildings, and he's successful is the bottom line. He's played by Van Heflin. He's married to Janet Leigh. They have a kid. And one day, well, the beginning of the movie opens with Robert Ryan in a trench coat and a hat. He's got a limp. He goes back to his apartment. He grabs a pistol, gets on a train, and you're just like, what is the deal with this? The movie's called Act of Violence, and he seems like the guy who's going to commit that act of violence. So he starts looking for Van Heflin's character. He shows up at his house just after he's left to go fishing, and Janet Leigh, you know, basically tells the guy where he is because he portrays himself as a friend. And he goes up and starts looking for him at the fishing place. You're like, this guy's really serious. He wants to kill Van Heflin. It's pretty clear. But the question becomes why? What happened? And I won't go into the specifics because the reveal of it is kind of part of the I don't want to say enjoyment, but like the unlocking of the story. But it becomes a thing where he just won't leave Van Heflin alone. Eventually, we start to see Van Heflin reacting to the fact that this guy's looking for him, and he knows that he has good reason to be looking for him, and he's wronged Robert Ryan in some way. And he gives some indication of it in the first meeting that he has with Janet Leigh, because now he's just like, he's like turning off all the lights in the house. He's like, can we eat in the kitchen tonight? You know, he's just trying to hide. And then somebody knocks at the door, don't answer the door. He's clearly terrified. And you're just like, what could he have done? Well, it has to do with the war. It has to do with the prisoner of war camp. And beyond that, I'm not going to say anything else. But it's interesting where it goes, because it becomes a story of like, you know, how can he protect himself from this guy who's just not going to stop? He's so determined to get some vengeance on Van Heflin, and it just builds and comes to a nice climax, you know, very noir ending. And yeah, it's solid all around. I had seen before, but looks wonderful on this new Blu-ray from Warner Archive. This disc includes a feature commentary with film historian Dr. Drew Casper, featurette Act of Violence, Dealing with the Devil, and classic cartoons Goggle Fishing Bear and The Shell-Shocked Egg. So your classic Night at the Movies setup. But definitely a solid noir from Fred Zinnemann, an Act of Violence. Then we have another noir tinged movie in this one here by Raoul Walsh, who I've talked about on the channel before. This is called The Man I Love. It's from 1946. The big headliner is Ida Lupino, and then the rest of the cast includes Robert Alda, Andrea King, Martha Vickers, Bruce Bennett, Alan Hale Sr. There's not a ton of folks I totally recognize. I either vaguely recognize some of them, but the reason I remember this movie, A, it's Raoul Walsh, who I'm a big fan of, but B, it's a movie that Scorsese has mentioned when he's talking about his film New York, New York, either in the commentary or I can't remember on one of his, American cinema documentaries or something. He goes into this idea about these sort of noir infused music-centric dramas, where you have a woman singer usually caught up in love with a not-so-great guy. And another example that he mentions is another Warner Archive Blu-ray, Love Me or Leave Me. That's with Doris Day and James Cagney. That's a little better than Man I Love, but it's a similar kind of thing. It's a little more, this is a little bit more like New York, New York. Whereas this has these elements, like, I forget the name of the actor. I think maybe it's Bruce Bennett. Yeah, it is. He plays Sam Thomas, who's a recording producer kind of, and also a musician. And she eventually meets him and sort of falls for him, but he's kind of a tragic dude. Like, he just can't get things sorted out. And there's a whole other plot with this son of a nightclub owner that's constantly hitting on Ida Lupino, but she's not really interested, but he's going to make trouble for her brother and sister. She's like hanging out with her brothers and sisters in this movie. They're adult grown people with kids, and there's some interesting subplots here, but the Sam Thomas part of it seems like the thing that ties in a little bit more to New York, New York. But I love these. The other one he called out is Blue Skies. It's a movie with Fred Astaire and Bing Crosby that's on a Kino Blu-ray. That's a similar kind of downer noir set in the world of musical performers, if you will. I really like New York, New York, New York, personally. I think it's a very dark movie, but it's also very funny in certain parts. The proposal scene where he asks her to run him over with the car is one of the funniest things I've seen in a movie. Anyway, that's New York, New York. But so Man I Love is special to me because of that. And I thought I had seen it, but I can't remember now. But it's pretty good. And Ida Lupino, love her. She's fantastic. As an actor in this role, she nails it. Obviously a great filmmaker in her own right. But this looks gorgeous in black and white. Includes classic WB cartoons, roughly squeaking and slick hair, but no commentary, unfortunately, or anything like that. But put it together with Love Me or Leave Me and New York, New York, and it's a nice little group of films for you to check out. Then we have Mr. and Mrs. Smith. No, not the Angelina and Brad Pitt movie. This is the original from 1941, directed by Mr. Alfred Hitchcock. Now, this one, I'm curious how they worded on the back here, but if you had to do it all over again, would you have married me? Yes, gentlemen, there is a right answer. That's something David Smith learns the hard way when his bubbly and beautiful wife Anne queries him over breakfast. Also, our right are radiant Carol Lombard and easygoing Robert Montgomery as the stars of this breezy Alfred Hitchcock comedy. Now, I think you can safely say this is the only straight comedy that he directed. His films often have comedic elements. I'm thinking like Trouble with Harry and things like that. They're kind of goofy. But this, I think, is the most straight comedy. Because Trouble with Harry is still pretty macabre in its way, and this is not that. This is much more of a standard. What I think of it as is sort of a retread of something like The Awful Truth. Not as good as The Awful Truth, I'll be straight up front. Like The Awful Truth with Irene Dunne and Cary Grant is just amazing and ridiculously funny, and they are kind of mean to each other, but they also kind of embarrass themselves in this way, and they obviously, I don't know, it's just a better movie. This one, I can say, it gets a little bit annoying, if I'm honest, where they're just kind of mean to each other and kind of obnoxious and manipulate each other in this way that becomes a little tedious. And this is my second time watching it. Blu-ray looks great. For 3 years, the Smiths have been bliss but battling. When a technicality voids their union, Mr., Mrs., orbiting the tale into a delightful confection of the screwball genre. From a script by Academy Award winner Norman Krasna, Hitchcock made his change of pace foray into the all-out humor memorable. Here again are his unmistakable touches. Look magazine declared, the net effects is the same too, another Alfred Hitchcock hit. So, yeah, it's, it's well done, and I love the lead actors, especially Carole Lombard. She really, if it was any other actor, it might almost be insufferable, but she makes even the most manipulative, kind of vindictive behavior kind of charming, because she's just so effervescent and wonderful. Robert Montgomery, I'm a big fan of. I love Ride the Pink Horse. That's a great Criterion. Definitely pick that up during the Criterion sale month at Barnes & Noble. A wonderful film noir that he directed and stars in and is great. He's pretty good here. He's a little boorish. The thing they're talking about at the breakfast conversation, there's a great shot of like, she's in her pajamas. She's got her feet on his legs. She's kind of like footsying with him. And they have all these rules. Like, you can't leave the bedroom until the argument is settled. So the movie actually opens with them in the bedroom after having been there for like 3 days and like had food brought into them, and finally they make up or whatever. But the other rule is like, they can't lie to each other, which, that's a tough one if you're a married person. I'm not saying that married people lie to each other, but like, there's some questions like the one that she asks him that he really shouldn't have answered how he does, which is, so she's got her feet on his legs. She's being all cute with him. She's like, if you had it to do again, would you marry me? And he's like, honestly, no. And he goes into his reasons why, and her feet slide off his legs. Her face droops. Obviously, she's totally distraught by this response. And soon after that, he has somebody visit him at his office where he tells him that the county they were married in was not incorporated properly, and basically they had no right to perform marriages, and so any marriages they did perform over a certain time are not null and void. And so they're supposed to get remarried, but he doesn't tell her right away, but she knows about it, and then it becomes a thing, and then they both start trying to see other people, and it gets kind of obnoxious. Although there is a great scene where Robert Montgomery's sitting at a dinner in a restaurant, and the date that he's been hired, Jack Carson is in this too. I'm trying to think, is there other good cast members? Gene Raymond plays the guy that kind of is going, he's partner to Robert Montgomery. I think they're lawyers. And he starts going after Carole Lombard. So Jack Carson brings Robert Montgomery on this double date with these two ladies. They're not necessarily stunningly attractive, and they are both big eaters. Like, they're just like really interested in the food, so they're just mowing on food, and it's kind of gross. And so he wants to leave that dinner, and he starts to try and, inconspicuously knock himself in the nose, so he gets a bloody nose and has to leave. And so his attempts to hit himself in the face are really funny, and where it goes after that is actually equally funny. There's also a bit where he's like, he's not into his date, but there's an attractive woman sitting next to him at the next table, but he's close enough that he can lean over next to her and kind of pretend to talk to her while she looks on. And his wife is dancing on the dance floor with his partner, so she can't hear anything. So he's mouthing words and making it look like they're together and making her jealous. And then eventually she turns and is like, what the heck are you doing, dude? And then her date shows up and wants to beat him up. There's some funny bits, definitely, but yeah, it's interesting from the point of view that it's Hitchcock's foray into screwball comedy. Looks great also. So this concludes this featurette, Mr. Hitchcock Meets the Smiths, which has like Robert Osborne and Peter Bogdanovich and Pat Hitchcock and several other folks talking about Hitchcock in general, talking about his approach to comedy, talking about this film specifically. I think Pat Hitchcock has the story of Hitchcock and his wife meeting Carole Lombard, Carole Lombard's husband, who of course was oh my gosh, why am I blanking on her husband? Clark Gable, of course. They meeting him on a train just after he'd heard about her plane crash and how destroyed he was and how sad they were to see. Anyway, but lots of great stories about Hitchcock and his approach to comedy and approach to filmmaking. A great little featurette in that. Then classic cartoons, holiday highlights, and stage fright. Classic short subject, Cinderella's Feller. 2 audio-only broadcasts, Lux Radio Theater broadcast with Carol Lombard and Bob Hope, and Screen Guild Players broadcast with Errol Flynn and Lana Turner of this same material. So fun stuff there if you like those, and I do. But nice to see this if you're a Hitchcock completist. Hard to get all this stuff, but in terms of the 30s and 40s on up, this is one that I've been wanting to get. Even though it kind of annoyed me on this rewatch, I still really am glad to have it. So that is the Hitchcock entry. And then in terms of the classic cinema, the last one we have here is The Shining Hour from 1938, directed by Frank Borzage. And this stars Joan Crawford, Margaret Sullivan, Robert Young, Melvin Douglas, and Hattie McDaniel, and a whole bunch of others. Like, this is another one where I want to... When Joan Crawford saw The Shining Hour on the Broadway stage, she pleaded with MGM executives to let her spread her acting wings in the film version. Miss Crawford got her way, playing a New York siren who marries a prosperous farmer, Melvin Douglas, and moves to Wisconsin. Woo, Wisconsin, my home state. There she is drawn to his handsome brother, Robert Young, even as she befriends the brother's selfless wife, Margaret Sullivan. Crawford's choice for the role, apparently. The passionate triangle plays out in the best tradition of classic screen melodrama, glossy and chic, but resonant and honest emotion, all under the expert direction of the great Frank Borzage. The film's heart-stopping climax, with Crawford battling flames to rescue Sullivan from certain death, is both literally and figuratively incendiary filmmaking. So yeah, this one, great cast, great director, obviously great stage material that was, incredibly inspirational to Joan Crawford, so much that she pushes so hard for this to get made and even helps pick the cast. She was obviously at the height of her, or one of the heights of her, control or power in Hollywood. Special features include an audio-only vintage MGM radio program, Good News of 1939, with scenes from The Shining Hour, classic cartoons, Love and Curses, Porky's 5 and 10, and The Sneezing Weasel, as well as the trailer. Also looks great. These Blu-rays from Warner Archive always look really good, and so I'm never disappointed in picture quality. They really take this stuff seriously. And speaking of which, this last thing, very exciting stuff for comic book fans. This is the Flash TV series, American television series, which first aired in September of 1990, starring the great John Wesley Shipp as Barry Allen, the Flash. I remember he would go on to star in Dawson's Creek. I think that's one of the big ones for him. But this is the thing I remember him for. I think a lot of people do. This was a huge deal to me in 1990. I was into movies. I was into comic books. I was into like The Punisher and other things. But there weren't a ton of, outside of like the Punisher adaptation with Dolph Lundgren, there weren't a ton of comic book movies that were coming out around that time that I'm remembering. I was even into like the Trial of the Incredible Hulk, the Hulk TV movies. I had like taped off TV and I would watch them. So I remember taping this pilot, which is like a 90 plus minute movie, and is a great origin story for the Flash, off TV, and being obsessed with it. And there were a lot of reasons why that I didn't even realize. One of which is that the theme music is done by Danny Elfman. Shirley Walker, I think, is the main composer, but the music is very Elfman-esque. And this is in the wake of Batman, which obviously was a big deal, and that was the comic book movie of the time, and a movie that I liked. But I've always been fascinated by The Flash, this idea of a guy who can run so fast and do things around that. He's been one of my favorites for a long time, and this is one of my favorite adaptations of his mythos, if you will. So this is really exciting. This is the entire original series I want to say there are 20. Wait, I'll read the back here. Whoosh, the origins and exploits of the crime-fighting DC comic superhero come your way with this in this 22-episode live-action series. John Wesley Shipp portrays Barry Allen, a police crime technologist endowed with sudden talents after a fluke lab accident. His lab is struck by lightning as a bunch of chemicals spill on him, and that's kind of his origin story. He pledges to use his new powers for good, the powers that include ultra speed reflexes and the ability to vibrate his molecules so rapidly that he can pass through solid walls. Amanda Pays is the medical researcher, Tina McGee, who monitors Alan's accelerated metabolism and guards his secret identity. The Trickster, Captain Cold, the Ghost, Mad Inventors. Central City is rife with criminals, so there's a lot of them that show up in this series, and that's super fun to see something produced on this scale that's done cinematically, and it looks fantastic. I mean, obviously they've gone back to the original elements, and it looks way better than... I mean, I saw this in 1990 on broadcast television, so it's just night and day between what I'm used to seeing and this. I mean, I can't remember. I'm sure this was on maybe DVD, but I never saw it then. So for me, my memory goes back to broadcast television, and this looks stunning in comparison. He's called the Flash. In our era of instant communications, he's more in step with the times than ever. So yeah, this is a really neat set. I don't think it has any extra features, unfortunately, but you do get all 22 episodes over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 discs. And again, they look fantastic. I didn't notice much in the way of compression. They really, really do. I think they're doing a max of 4 episodes. So, you know, they're pushing it a little bit, but it really looks fantastic. And yeah, this just was, for me, one of the definitive superhero experiences of my youth. You know, in 1990, I was in high school, and it was just the time when I was ready for this. So fascinating stuff. You know, Amanda Pays, I just saw in Leviathan, I think, and I was like, why do I know her? And I'm pretty sure that my memory goes back to her as this scientist that's helping, that's helping out the Barry Allen character. Yeah, so like, I guess this stuff, it says multiple references to this series have been made on the 2014 Flash TV series, which I haven't seen, including John Wesley Shipp portraying multiple characters. Shipp also reprised his role as Barry Allen from the series in the crossovers Elseworlds and Crisis on Infinite Earths, which established the Flash as existing on a parallel Earth to the Arrowverse series, including Earth 90, with Amanda Pays, Desert, and Mark Hamill reprising their roles as alternate universe versions of Tina McGee, Julio Mendez, and the Trickster. So yeah, that Trickster on the back is, I guess, Mark Hamill, which I had totally forgotten about. I don't even know if I saw all 22 episodes of this show, because the pilot was such a big deal, but then I think I lost track of it, and I can't remember if it kind of got messed with in its distribution, meaning like that they preempted it or they bumped it or whatever, so that it didn't do as well as it could have, or they didn't run concurrently. I don't remember, but I feel like there might have been some issues. I may be speaking out of school on that. But yeah. Richard Belzer is a recurring character, a recurring actor in this. Mark Hamill again. Joyce Heiser from Just One of the Guys. M. Emmett Walsh is Henry Allen. He plays Barry's dad. Dick Miller is in this. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting guest stars on this show. David Cassidy. Jeffrey Combs shows up. Denise Crosby. Bill Mumy from The Twilight Zone. I always remember him from, and Dennis the Menace, I guess. Jerry Ryan. Tim Thomerson is Barry Allen's brother. So there's a lot of cool stuff in this in terms of the cast. And I guess there were 4 Flash suits made for John Wesley Shipp for this show at a total cost of $100,000. And I guess John had to have his entire body cast to this suit to make it out of latex, and it was a pretty trying thing. Let's see here. Danny Elfman composed the theme. There's a whole episode guide online if you want to check that out. But just a fascinating, I've said that a lot this round, release in terms of it's the right time. I mean, even Marvel is kind of on the wane at this point. DC may be coming back. But it's a good time, I think, for this to come out. And I know a lot of people are excited about it, and it looks great. Highly recommended. I would love to have had some features on it, but I'll take it because it just looks so good and it really brings me back. So anyway, that'll do it for this round of stuff. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.